Quiet strength over loud intimidation appears first not as a slogan but as a lived reality, one that unfolds in everyday spaces where noise often masquerades as authority. Loud intimidation relies on spectacle, raised voices, sudden movements, public posturing meant to overwhelm others before they have time to think. Quiet strength works in the opposite direction. It does not rush to fill the air, it settles into it. The person who carries it does not need to announce dominance because they are not trying to seize control of others. They are maintaining control of themselves. This kind of strength changes the emotional temperature of a room. Where intimidation demands reaction, quiet strength removes the fuel by refusing to escalate. It frustrates aggressors precisely because it cannot be easily manipulated. There is no obvious handle to grab, no emotional hook to pull. Silence, patience, and steady presence become barriers that noise cannot penetrate. In environments driven by hierarchy, people often mistake volume for leadership. The loudest voice is assumed to be the strongest, the most aggressive posture mistaken for confidence. Quiet strength exposes that illusion. It shows that confidence does not need witnesses to exist. A calm individual who remains grounded under pressure communicates something far more unsettling to an aggressor. Nothing you do can shake me. This unsettles those who depend on intimidation because their power is borrowed from fear. When fear disappears, so does their leverage. Quiet strength denies them that currency. It is not passive, it is intentional restraint. Every measured breath, every controlled response is a choice to remain centered rather than reactive. There is also a moral clarity embedded in quiet strength. It does not seek to dominate others or humiliate them. It seeks balance. This makes it sustainable. Loud intimidation burns fast and leaves destruction in its wake, often isolating the very person who uses it. Quiet strength builds credibility over time. People begin to notice who remains composed when situations become unstable. Trust shifts subtly toward those individuals. Respect follows, not because it was demanded, but because it was demonstrated. In moments of conflict, observers instinctively look to the calmest person, sensing that stability often signals capability. Underestimation is the greatest mistake emerges naturally from this contrast. When people equate loudness with power, they underestimate those who move quietly. Underestimation is rarely accidental. It is a shortcut the mind takes to avoid deeper assessment. It is easier to assume that someone calm is weak than to consider that they may be disciplined. This mistake compounds over time. Each ignored signal, each dismissed capability builds a false sense of superiority in the one doing the underestimating. They grow careless. They stop observing closely. They act without preparation, convinced the outcome is already decided. Underestimation thrives on surface-level judgments. It ignores context, training, and internal resilience. It overlooks the fact that restraint often comes from experience, not fear. When someone consistently chooses calm responses, it may indicate they understand consequences better than those who lash out. The greatest mistake occurs when an aggressor confuses silence for surrender. Silence can be strategic. It can be a way of gathering information, conserving energy, or avoiding unnecessary conflict. Those who underestimate fail to recognize that patience is often a sign of confidence, not hesitation. The consequences of underestimation are rarely small. When reality finally contradicts the false narrative someone has built, the correction is abrupt and often humiliating. The shock comes not just from losing control, but from realizing how wrong the initial assumption was. This is why underestimation feels so personal when it backfires. It exposes flawed judgment. It reveals that the aggressor was not reading the situation accurately. In that moment, the quiet individual is no longer invisible. Their capabilities become undeniable, and the power dynamic shifts instantly. Underestimation also affects groups, not just individuals. When a crowd collectively misjudges someone, the correction ripples outward. Witnesses reassess their own assumptions. They begin questioning how often they rely on appearances instead of evidence. Quiet strength forces that reckoning. It teaches that the absence of noise does not mean the absence of depth. Often, it means the presence of control. This realization can be unsettling because it challenges the belief that power must always look aggressive. Both ideas intersect in a single truth. The most dangerous mistake is assuming you understand someone without truly observing them. Quiet strength does not reveal itself on demand. It waits. Underestimation accelerates its own downfall by pushing situations toward moments where restraint is no longer optional. When that threshold is crossed, the response is decisive, not emotional. It is rooted in preparation rather than impulse. Those who underestimate it are left scrambling, trying to reconcile their expectations with reality. There is a lesson here about awareness. Those who rely on intimidation often stop paying attention to details. They become addicted to reaction. Quiet individuals, by contrast, tend to observe more than they speak. They notice patterns, tones, shifts in behavior. This awareness compounds over time, giving them an advantage that is invisible until it matters. Underestimation blinds people to this accumulation of awareness. It convinces them that nothing is happening beneath the surface, when in fact everything is. The irony is that quiet strength often wants to avoid confrontation altogether. It prefers equilibrium. It exists comfortably without recognition. But when forced into action, it does not hesitate, because it has already considered the cost. Underestimation removes the chance for peaceful resolution by pushing too far, too carelessly. The mistake is not just misjudging strength, but misunderstanding intent. Calm is not an invitation to dominate. It is often a warning that escalation will not end the way one expects. As these dynamics unfold, the environment itself changes. People begin recalibrating whom they listen to, whom they follow, whom they provoke. Loud intimidation loses its mystique. Quiet strength gains gravity. Underestimation fades, replaced by caution. And in that shift, the unspoken rules of interaction are rewritten, not by forceful declarations, but by the undeniable presence of someone who never needed to raise their voice to be taken seriously. Self-discipline as the ultimate defense is often misunderstood because defense is usually imagined as something external: physical strength, speed, or the ability to overpower another person. Self-discipline operates on a different plane. It governs impulse, reaction, and decision-making long before any confrontation occurs. It is the invisible structure that determines whether someone escalates a situation or neutralizes it before it grows. A disciplined individual does not act from pride or emotion. They act from clarity. This clarity allows them to choose restraint when others choose aggression, and action only when it becomes unavoidable. Self-discipline is what prevents strength from turning into recklessness. Without it, even the most skilled person becomes dangerous to themselves. This kind of discipline is built slowly through repetition and intentional discomfort. It requires sitting with frustration without releasing it outward. It requires learning to breathe through tension instead of feeding it. Over time, this internal control becomes reflexive. When pressure appears, the body does not panic, the mind does not scatter. Everything narrows toward what matters. This is why self-discipline functions as defense long before fists, words, or movements come into play. It keeps situations from spiraling. It filters responses. It creates space between stimulus and action, and in that space lies choice. Many conflicts escalate not because of necessity, but because of ego. Self-discipline dissolves ego's grip. It reminds the individual that being right, being seen, or being feared are not worth the consequences that follow impulsive behavior. A disciplined person understands that walking away is not weakness if it preserves stability. They also understand that when action is required, hesitation caused by fear or indecision can be just as dangerous as overreaction. Self-discipline balances these extremes. It trains someone to remain neutral until neutrality is no longer safe, and decisive only when decisiveness is justified. There is also a moral dimension to self-discipline as defense. It ensures that force, if used, is proportional. It prevents the crossing of lines that cannot be uncrossed. This is critical because once control is lost, damage extends beyond the immediate moment. Reputations are altered, futures are affected. A disciplined person accounts for these long-term consequences, even under stress. Their defense is not just about survival in the moment, but about preserving integrity afterward. Preservation is a form of strength that outlasts any physical exchange. Listening as a weapon of awareness complements this discipline by sharpening perception. Listening is often dismissed as passive, but in reality it is an active skill that requires focus and intention. True listening gathers information continuously. It tracks tone, rhythm, movement, and shifts in energy. While others are busy projecting their intentions outward, the listener is absorbing data. This accumulation creates situational awareness that cannot be replicated by sight alone. Awareness built through listening allows someone to anticipate rather than react, to adjust rather than panic. In tense environments, noise often hides important signals. Raised voices, sudden movements, and chaotic energy overwhelm the senses and reduce clarity. A trained listener cuts through that noise. They identify patterns beneath the surface. They recognize when someone's anger is performative versus when it is genuine. They hear the difference between confidence and insecurity in a voice. This awareness is powerful because it exposes intention. When intention is understood, response becomes precise. There is no wasted motion, no guessing. Everything is informed. Listening also slows time. While others rush forward driven by impulse, the listener experiences moments in finer detail. This creates the illusion of speed when action finally occurs. In reality, the advantage comes from preparation. Awareness compresses decision-making because the necessary information is already processed. This is why listening can function as a weapon. It disarms unpredictability. It reduces surprise. It transforms chaotic situations into readable ones. Self-discipline and listening reinforce each other. Discipline keeps the mind quiet enough to hear clearly. Listening provides the information discipline needs to choose the correct response. Together, they form a defensive system that operates internally first. This system does not depend on dominance or intimidation. It depends on understanding. Someone who listens well rarely needs to prove anything because they already know where they stand within the situation. That knowledge breeds confidence without arrogance. There is a social impact to this combination as well. People tend to reveal more around those who listen without reacting. They underestimate the listener, assuming their silence means disengagement. In truth, every word spoken becomes part of a larger picture. This is how awareness grows unnoticed. When conflict arises, the listener already understands the dynamics at play. They know who is bluffing, who is afraid, and who is likely to escalate. This knowledge allows them to position themselves safely and effectively. Listening also cultivates empathy, which further strengthens defense. Empathy does not mean excusing harmful behavior. It means understanding motivation. When motivation is clear, responses can be tailored to de-escalate rather than inflame. A disciplined listener can redirect tension with a few well-chosen words or a deliberate pause. This ability prevents conflicts that others stumble into blindly. It keeps situations contained. In moments where defense becomes unavoidable, listening continues to play a role. The body reacts to cues faster than conscious thought. A trained listener picks up on subtle shifts, a change in breathing, a shift in weight, a hesitation before movement. These cues provide fractions of seconds that matter. They allow for positioning, evasion, or counteraction without panic. What looks like instinct is actually refined awareness. At its core, both self-discipline and listening reject chaos. They are practices of order. They refuse to let external disorder dictate internal state. This refusal is what makes them powerful. An undisciplined person who does not listen is easy to provoke, easy to manipulate, easy to control. A disciplined listener becomes unpredictable in the best way. They cannot be rushed, baited, or overwhelmed easily. Their calm becomes a barrier that others struggle to breach. These qualities are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They develop quietly, often unnoticed, until a moment arrives where they matter. When that moment comes, the response appears effortless, almost inevitable. Observers often mistake this for natural talent or luck. In reality, it is the result of countless moments of restraint, attention, and internal regulation. Self-discipline has already decided the boundary. Listening has already mapped the terrain. Action, if taken, simply follows what has already been understood. Respect is earned without demands reveals itself in the way influence actually forms, rather than how people imagine it should. Demands are shortcuts taken by those who feel unsure of their standing. They rely on pressure, threats, or repeated assertions of authority because they lack evidence that others would follow willingly. Earned respect moves differently. It grows from consistency, from the quiet alignment between words and actions over time. People begin to trust what they can predict, and they respect what proves reliable under pressure. Someone who never asks for respect, but behaves with integrity, invites others to grant it voluntarily. This kind of respect cannot be forced because it is not transactional. It does not come from fear of consequences or hope of reward. It emerges when observers notice restraint where aggression would be easier, patience where ego would demand reaction. Each moment of self-control becomes a data point. Over time, those points form a pattern that others recognize instinctively. Respect attaches itself to that pattern, not because it was requested, but because it feels deserved. When respect is earned this way, it is resilient. It does not vanish the moment circumstances change. Demanded respect, by contrast, is fragile. It depends on constant reinforcement. The moment the threat weakens or attention shifts, it erodes. People comply outwardly but resist inwardly. Earned respect does the opposite. Even in absence, it lingers. People continue to measure their behavior against the standard they witnessed. This is why earned respect often outlasts authority. Titles expire, reputations endure. There is a humility embedded in earning respect without demands. It requires acceptance that validation cannot be controlled. One must be willing to act correctly even when no acknowledgement follows. This patience filters out performative behavior. Actions taken solely to be seen lose power when recognition is uncertain. What remains are actions taken because they align with principle. Observers sense this difference. They can tell when someone is acting for approval versus acting from conviction. Respect flows toward conviction. Bullying thrives on reaction, not resistance, exposes why demanded respect so often fails. Bullying depends on emotional feedback. It feeds on visible discomfort, anger, fear, or submission. These reactions confirm the bully's perceived dominance. Resistance, in the traditional sense, loud confrontation or immediate retaliation, often provides the same fuel. It escalates the dynamic without dismantling it. The bully still gets what they want: engagement. Reaction validates their presence. When reaction is removed, the structure collapses. Calm responses, delayed reactions, or deliberate non-engagement deny the bully their reward. This is deeply unsettling to someone who relies on control through provocation. They are forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their behavior is no longer shaping the environment. Without reaction, their power feels imaginary. This is why bullies often intensify their behavior when ignored. They are chasing the reaction that confirms their influence. The resistance that works is strategic rather than emotional. It is measured, not reflexive. It acknowledges the attempt at provocation without feeding it. This form of resistance aligns closely with earned respect. Observers notice who refuses to be dragged into chaos. They recognize the strength required to remain composed under pressure. Over time, attention shifts away from the bully and toward the person who remains steady. Social dynamics adjust accordingly. Bullying also thrives on isolation. Reaction isolates the target by making them appear unstable or overly emotional. Calm, composed responses do the opposite. They invite support. Others feel safer stepping in or speaking up when the situation is not exploding emotionally. The bully loses their advantage as the environment becomes less reactive. This shift often happens subtly. The bully's words start landing in silence. Their actions look excessive rather than intimidating. The narrative changes. Earned respect plays a crucial role here because people are more willing to support someone they respect. When someone has consistently acted with restraint and fairness, others feel invested in their well-being. They do not see them as a source of drama. They see them as grounded. This perception changes how conflicts unfold. Bullies sense when the social ground beneath them is unstable. They become cautious when they realize reaction is no longer guaranteed. There is also an internal transformation that occurs when one stops reacting. Emotional energy is conserved. Instead of being drained by constant provocation, it is redirected toward awareness and preparation. This internal stability becomes visible externally. Body language shifts, tone remains even. These signals communicate boundaries without confrontation. The bully encounters resistance not as opposition, but as absence. There is nothing to push against. Over time, this absence reshapes behavior. Bullies either escalate recklessly or withdraw. Both outcomes reduce their influence. Escalation exposes their lack of control. Withdrawal exposes their dependence on reaction. In both cases, their perceived authority diminishes. Meanwhile, the individual who refuses to react gains credibility. Their silence becomes associated with strength rather than weakness. Respect accumulates naturally. Respect earned without demands also changes self-perception. When someone no longer relies on external validation, their sense of worth stabilizes. They are less vulnerable to provocation because their identity is not at stake in every interaction. This detachment is not indifference, it is security. It allows them to choose responses rather than being compelled by emotion. Bullies struggle against this because it removes their leverage. Reaction-based dynamics are predictable. Calm disrupts predictability. This unpredictability unsettles those who rely on dominance through routine intimidation. They do not know how to adapt when their usual tactics fail. This creates hesitation. Hesitation breaks momentum. Momentum is everything in bullying. Without it, the behavior loses coherence. Observers learn from these interactions as well. They begin to recognize that strength does not always look aggressive. They see that restraint can shift power more effectively than confrontation. This realization spreads quietly. Social norms adjust. What was once tolerated becomes embarrassing. The bully's behavior starts to look outdated, out of place. Earned respect amplifies this shift by providing an alternative model of authority. Importantly, not reacting does not mean accepting harm indefinitely. It means choosing when and how to respond. There are moments when direct action becomes necessary. The difference lies in timing and intent. A response delivered calmly, decisively, and without emotional overflow carries far more weight than impulsive retaliation. When action finally occurs, it surprises because it is not habitual. It is perceived as justified rather than reactive. This is why bullying fears composure more than defiance. Defiance can be challenged. Composure cannot be easily attacked. It reflects an internal order that external chaos cannot penetrate. Earned respect reinforces this order by surrounding the composed individual with social credibility. The bully finds themselves isolated, reacting more than provoking, chasing relevance they once assumed was guaranteed. As these patterns repeat, the environment itself changes. People become less responsive to intimidation. They take cues from those who remain steady. Earned respect becomes the new currency. Bullying loses its payoff. Reaction dries up, and in that silence, the balance of power shifts. Quietly, persistently, without any demand ever being made. The power of staying unprovoked is not rooted in avoidance but in mastery over internal reactions. Provocation is designed to hijack attention and force emotional movement, pulling someone into a dynamic they did not choose. Staying unprovoked interrupts that mechanism. It keeps ownership of the moment where it belongs. When insults, threats, or pressure fail to trigger visible response, the instigator loses control of the interaction. Calm becomes a mirror that reflects the aggressor's behavior back to them without distortion. This restraint requires awareness because the impulse to react is natural. Choosing not to act on it is deliberate. Each time restraint is practiced, the nervous system learns that calm is an option even under stress. Over time, this rewires instinct. The individual no longer feels urgency to defend ego or image. They become difficult to manipulate because provocation no longer guarantees engagement. Observers sense this stability. They recognize that someone who remains unprovoked is operating from confidence rather than fear. The situation slows, space opens, options appear. What might have escalated dissolves into uncertainty for the one attempting to provoke because their script is no longer being followed. The silence, the steady posture, the measured breath all communicate a boundary without confrontation. It says, There is nothing here for you to control. Strength revealed in critical moments explains why this restraint matters when pressure peaks. Anyone can appear composed when nothing is at stake. True strength surfaces when tension demands a choice. Critical moments compress time. They remove rehearsals and expose default behavior. In those moments, training, discipline, and values surface without disguise. The individual who has practiced staying unprovoked does not freeze or explode. They respond with clarity. Their actions are economical, intentional, and aligned with necessity rather than emotion. Observers often describe this as sudden or surprising, but it is neither. It is the natural outcome of preparation meeting pressure. Strength here is not loud. It is precise. It does not seek to dominate the moment, but to resolve it. Once the moment passes, there is no need for explanation or celebration. The response speaks for itself, and the silence that follows carries more weight than any declaration. Defense is not aggression, is a distinction many fail to recognize because emotion often blurs intent. Defense arises from necessity, not desire. It is a response to threat, not an attempt to dominate or humiliate. When someone defends themselves, the goal is restoration of safety, not victory. Aggression seeks control, attention, or validation. Defense seeks stability. The difference lies in restraint. Defensive action stops when the threat stops. It does not linger, escalate, or seek revenge. This restraint communicates clarity. It tells observers that boundaries exist and will be enforced without excess. Those who understand this do not feel the need to justify themselves loudly. Their actions are measured, proportional, and rooted in self-preservation rather than ego. This understanding prevents guilt and hesitation in moments where action is required because the intent is clean and grounded. True confidence requires no audience because it is internally sourced rather than externally fed. Confidence that depends on attention weakens when no one is watching. True confidence remains unchanged whether observed or ignored. It does not perform, it does not announce itself, it shows through posture, timing, and the absence of unnecessary explanation. Someone who is truly confident does not chase validation or comparison. They are comfortable with silence. They do not rush to prove competence because they already trust it. This makes their presence steady rather than reactive. Others sense this and respond differently, often with curiosity or respect. The lack of performance becomes its own signal. It suggests security, preparation, and self-acknowledge without requiring approval. Leadership emerges without announcement, begins in moments so ordinary they rarely attract attention. It does not arrive with speeches, titles, or visible authority. It forms quietly through behavior that remains consistent regardless of who is watching. People begin to notice patterns long before they recognize leadership. They notice who remains calm when situations become tense, who listens without interrupting, who acts without needing credit. This kind of leadership does not compete for dominance. It fills a vacuum others are too distracted to see. When confusion spreads, people instinctively look toward the individual who appears least affected by it. That glance is not conscious. It is reflexive. Stability attracts attention in unstable environments. This leadership grows through trust rather than fear. Trust accumulates when actions align with principles repeatedly over time. There is no need to convince others because the evidence is already present. When someone handles pressure without panic, responds to conflict without cruelty, and remains fair even when unfairness would benefit them, observers begin adjusting their expectations. They start to measure situations against that person's reaction. Without realizing it, they are already following. Leadership has already occurred before anyone names it. What makes this emergence powerful is its inevitability. No announcement is needed because the role is assumed naturally. People defer without being told. They seek input without obligation. They adjust their behavior simply by being near someone who carries themselves with clarity. This kind of leadership does not rely on control. It relies on influence, and influence is quieter than command. It spreads laterally, not vertically. It is shared through observation rather than instruction. There is also an absence of insecurity in this leadership. Because it was not pursued, it does not need to be defended. The individual does not feel threatened by others stepping forward or contributing. They are not guarding status. This openness strengthens their position rather than weakening it. Others feel safe around leaders who do not compete for attention. Safety creates loyalty. Loyalty sustains leadership long after circumstances change. Leadership that emerges this way also adapts easily. It is not rigid or dependent on fixed roles. It responds to the needs of the moment rather than clinging to authority. This flexibility increases credibility. People trust those who can adjust without losing themselves. It signals depth rather than performance. The leader is not playing a role. They are expressing character. Silence plays a crucial role here. Not every moment requires input. Knowing when not to speak often carries more weight than speaking often. When this individual does speak, people listen because silence has already filtered out unnecessary words. Each contribution feels intentional. This selectiveness reinforces influence. People sense that nothing is said lightly. Leadership becomes associated with discernment rather than volume. Leadership that emerges without announcement often surprises those who rely on formal power. They expect obedience to flow from position. Instead, they find attention drifting towards someone else. This shift is subtle but decisive. It cannot be reversed with commands because it was never created by them. It was created by trust. Trust does not respond to force. Silence can redefine an entire room, builds on this foundation by showing how absence of noise can shape collective behavior. Silence is often misinterpreted as emptiness. In reality, silence is full of information. It reveals discomfort, anticipation, respect, or uncertainty. When someone chooses silence deliberately, it becomes communicative. It interrupts patterns people are used to. In spaces where reactions are expected, silence destabilizes assumption. A room accustomed to noise operates on momentum. Conversations overlap, emotions bounce off each other. Silence cuts through that momentum. It forces awareness. People become conscious of their own behavior. They notice tone, posture, and proximity. Silence creates contrast. Against that contrast, even small movements or words gain weight. This is why silence can feel uncomfortable. It removes distraction. When someone remains silent during provocation, the room begins to shift. Attention turns toward the aggressor, not the target. Without reaction to absorb focus, the behavior stands exposed. The room starts evaluating instead of participating. This evaluation changes the social dynamic. What once felt normal begins to feel excessive. Silence reframes the moment without confrontation. Silence also invites projection. People fill quiet with interpretation. If the person remaining silent carries composure, others project confidence onto them. They assume intention and control. This projection amplifies presence. The individual does not need to assert anything. The room assigns meaning on its own. This is powerful because it requires no effort. In leadership contexts, silence signals certainty. A leader who does not rush to respond suggests they are not threatened. They are comfortable allowing situations to unfold because they trust their ability to respond when necessary. This patience reassures others. It communicates that nothing is out of control. The room settles into that rhythm. Silence also slows decision-making in a beneficial way. Instead of reacting impulsively, people pause. Pauses allow reflection. Reflection improves outcomes. A silent presence often becomes the anchor during these pauses. People look to them not because they spoke, but because they did not. Their stillness provides reference. There is discipline required to use silence effectively. Uncontrolled silence can signal confusion or avoidance. Intentional silence signals awareness. The difference lies in posture, breath, and timing. A composed silence feels different. It holds the room rather than escaping it. People sense that distinction intuitively. When silence is paired with decisive action at the right moment, its impact multiplies. The contrast between stillness and movement sharpens perception. Action appears clearer, more justified. There is no emotional residue cluttering the response. The room accepts it more readily because it was not rushed. Over time, people associate silence with authority. They learn that when this individual is quiet, something is being processed. They wait. Waiting itself is a form of deference. The hierarchy shifts without explicit acknowledgement. Silence has already redefined the space. Both leadership emerging without announcement and silence redefining a room depend on self-regulation. They require comfort with not being seen immediately. They require trust in timing. Those who master this are rarely desperate for recognition. Their influence grows precisely because they are not chasing it. These dynamics alter group behavior subtly but permanently. Conversations become more measured. Provocation loses effectiveness. Attention reorganizes itself around stability. The loudest voices no longer dominate automatically. People begin valuing clarity over volume. The environment evolves. In such spaces, leadership feels less like control and more like guidance. Silence becomes a tool rather than a void. Authority is recognized rather than enforced. Those who understand this do not rush to fill gaps with noise. They allow presence to speak. As these patterns repeat, people internalize them. They begin practicing restraint themselves. The culture shifts. What was once chaotic becomes intentional. What was once reactive becomes observant. Leadership is no longer associated with dominance, but with steadiness. The individual at the center of this shift may never label themselves a leader. They may never acknowledge the change directly, yet their influence is undeniable. People consult them. They follow their lead without being told. Silence accompanies them, not as emptiness, but as weight. If this story made you pause, reflect, or see strength from a different angle, don't let it end here. Stories like this aren't just meant to be heard. They're meant to stay with you, to challenge how you see power, discipline, and control in the real world. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next narrative that cuts deeper than noise and speaks to the part of you that recognizes quiet strength. If this resonated, tap the like button. It tells the algorithm this kind of storytelling matters and helps it reach others who need to hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stood out to you? What line hit harder than you expected? Your perspective shapes what comes next on this channel. And if you know someone who underestimates the power of calm, share this with them. More stories are coming, stories that don't shout for attention but earn it.